Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Ezra Shankin, and I have the pleasure of serving as CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Vancouver. I would like to extend a special thank you to our friends at the consulate in Toronto and Western Canada, and obviously the National Library of Israel and our amazing partners at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. We're thrilled to be able to work together on this fantastic event. It's a pleasure, as always, to join you for these webinar opportunities and to be joining with one of the most significant cultural institutions in the Jewish world, highlighting Hannah Senesh's archives and marking the centenary of her birth in 1921. It is now my deep pleasure to introduce our amazing Consul General. Now, I say that when we have the former Consul General on at the same time, who is also amazing, also great. I see them kind of both on my screens right here. I'm looking at them. But I do have the pleasure of introducing our sitting Consul General, Galit Baram, who is a dear friend, as is DJ, and is doing really just incredible work. I think we've had time with her talking about the pandemic and what it's been to be a diplomat during the pandemic. But Galit was, I'll give you a little bit of background, but Galit was born in Jerusalem. Her academic background includes obviously bachelor's degree from Tel Aviv University and a master's degree in American Studies from Hebrew University. She began her career in the ministry as a political assistant in the Director General's Bureau. She later held positions of deputy director in the same department before her current posting. Consul General Baram served as director of the Department of Palestinian Affairs and Regional Cooperation. In 2016, Consul Baram arrived in Toronto to take up her current position as Consul General. She is married to a fellow diplomat who is also here in Canada with us and serving and doing an incredible job. And we welcome her. So welcome, Consul General Baram.
Ezra, thank you very much. Thank you for this warm presentation. I would like to thank you for this opportunity, for mentioning me and DJ together. And I just want to tell you that, and it's not related to the subject of the presentation today, but DJ and I actually joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs together at the same cadet course 26 years ago. Time flies, and it's unbelievable. And I remember that around this time of the year, about 5 years ago in 2016, I came to Toronto on a first orientation visit. I met DJ and we discussed the position, we discussed the Jewish community, Canada in general. And it's been 5 years already, and I'm doing pretty much the same thing with my successor, Idit Shamir, an experienced diplomat who will join us in the summer. And what can I say, when a diplomat finds herself in a position of passing the baton, then it's a very sentimental moment. So I'm very glad to share this event with my dear friend and colleague, DJ Schneeweiss. I would like to thank the Federation and the many good people there, Ezra, Ifat Elon Haber, and Daphne Zilberstein. And special thanks to Nirit Sweat from the consulate, who worked very hard on this event. I'm glad to be, again, to attend an event with you, friends, in Vancouver, even though not in person. It's been a very long time since my last visit to Vancouver due to COVID, and it breaks my heart, really. I think that a diplomatic visit to Vancouver is long overdue, and I do hope that the situation will improve as we get closer to the summer and will enable me to come and visit Vancouver again. It's been a year since the beginning of the pandemic, and I just want to mention, and this is probably not news to you, that Israel is the leading country in the world in the number of citizens who have been already vaccinated. I'm actually talking to you now from Israel, from my parents' home in the Jezreel Valley, not from Toronto. And I arrived earlier today from Canada in the framework of a campaign that is led by Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs to vaccinate Israeli diplomats serving abroad. And in this work, many of my colleagues in Asia, in Africa, in Europe have been already vaccinated. And now it's the turn of North America and Latin America. And I'll spend the next 3 or 4 weeks here in Israel before I head back to Toronto. This is a very busy time for us at the consulate. Just to mention that we already voted abroad on the 11th, on March 11th, and the upcoming fourth round of Israeli elections is coming right up on the 23rd of March. These are very exciting days in Israel, and I'm sure that the political events will keep us very busy in the coming weeks. All our activity in the past year was held on it's not, it goes a little against the definition of diplomacy, which relies heavily on meeting people in person, reaching out to people, connecting not only to countries but to organizations and to people. And this is not the same thing, but at least I can tell you that thank God for the wonders of technology that enable us to meet at least this way. A few months ago, we hosted an event, a very similar event with the National Library of Israel in Toronto. We concentrated more on Muslim and Jewish ancient texts. And that presentation reflected the diversity of the nature of the activity of the National Library of Israel, pretty much like the colorful tapestry that is Israel today. And this event will be dedicated to Hannah Senesh, to her work, to her poems, and her tremendous courage, a true Israeli hero that is, in my view, the embodiment of the connection between Israel and the diaspora. This element, this strong bond between Israel and the diaspora is so important today, exactly as it was during World War II and during the nascent years of the State of Israel. You're going to hear some wonderful presentations from DJ Schneeweiss and from Dr. Raquel Yukelis, who are joining us both from Jerusalem. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. I know that the competition is hard. I know there is webinar fatigue and Zoom fatigue, and we have to compete very hard for your attention. And I thank you for finding the time to join us today. We're truly honored, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy the wonderful presentations. Before we continue, I would like to introduce Candace Quinter, who is chair of the Israel and Global Engagement Committee at the Jewish Federation of Vancouver, to say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Consul General Barham, and thank you to the National Library for sharing your important work with us today. The Jewish Federation and the Consulate General of Israel to Toronto and Western Canada have an exceptional and long-standing relationship. For many years, our Israel and Global Engagement Department has collaborated with the Consulate on a variety of areas and initiatives. In addition to facilitating consular services to Israel citizens living in BC, the Israel and Global Engagement Department worked closely with the consulate to build mutually beneficial cooperation between Israel and Canadian partners in high-tech and innovation, arts and culture, and intercommunity relations. I want to thank the Consul General, Consul, and the consulate staff for their inspiring work and for partnering with us on many significant events, briefings, and community initiatives that foster awareness, increase understanding, and help us to come together to celebrate. Thank you for helping us bring Israel to the greater Vancouver community. It is now my pleasure to introduce DJ Schneeweiss. DJ is known to many here from his time in Israel's Consul General to Toronto and Western Canada from 2012 to 2016. In 2019, DJ completed a distinguished 25-year career in Israel's diplomatic corps, during which he served on the personal staff of multiple foreign ministers and represented Israel in London, Beijing, and Toronto. DJ currently works with the National Library of Israel, enhancing the library's international partnerships and deepening its ties with the Jewish world. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Candice, and thank you to everybody for all the kind words and the warm welcome. Consul General for the collaboration, hospitality, and of course to our partners at the Federation and at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Center. It really is a pleasure to be in touch again, representing not the country as a whole, but an institution that itself captures and represents the country as a whole. There's something quite special about the library, and I have the privilege of working with a wonderful team of people. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes now introducing you all to the library itself, because it may well be an institution that people have not really encountered before. And then I'll hand over to Raquel, who will bring us into the world of Chana Senesh. But let me first just spend a few minutes talking to you about the library, and I'm going to share my screen here, and we will see a few slides which hopefully will help tell the story. Let's get this up. Okay, I hope everybody can see that. The title says it all in a way. This is a library that belongs to every single Jew around the world. It's a library that serves each and every one of Israel's citizens, but it also very much has a role as the library of the Jewish people. And when we think about a library, it sort of feels almost natural, doesn't it? It's something in our blood, it's in our veins. And this quote from Rabbi Sachs, who was a great supporter of the library, tells it all. There's something about the people of the book and its relationship with books that really does run deep. And the National Library and the new building we're building at the moment is really going to be a wonderful home for our books in the homeland of the people of the book. Resonances and the depth of the story here are quite significant. The history of the library is a long one. It's one of the first cultural institutions established by the Yishuv, by the early immigrants in the modern Zionist history already in 1892. And so already 120 years old more. The library is one of the most venerable and oldest cultural institutions in the country. At the same time, it's one of the newest because it's undergoing a renewal at the moment that is reshaping its role and reshaping its face and its relationship with the society as a whole. The library has, of course, been through the entire story of the state. It was incorporated in the Hebrew University in the 1920s. This slide I'm showing you now shows how some of the books that were held on Mount Scopus had to be escorted down from Mount Scopus during the War of Independence to keep them safe. And again, this slide, I think, tells a great story about our relationship with our books and our heritage and how we're so determined to protect them and to make sure that they last not only for our generation, but into the future. Just to give you a sense of the scope and the size of the library, just see some of these numbers. The library holds 5 million books, 2 million photographs, 2,500 Arabic manuscripts, thousands upon thousands of hours of digital music. You can see all the numbers there on your screen. It is an immensely rich place which has been collecting for 120 years every possible significant aspect of our story, whether from Israel or from the Jewish story beyond. The library's collections are divided into 4 collections. All of these holdings are divided into 4 collections. The Judaica collection is the central one, and it's the largest and most comprehensive collection in the world, and is uniquely rich and diverse in its scope. Alongside the Judaica collection, here's just a few sort of images from the collection. At the bottom left, you have a copy of the orate, the Ethiopian Sefer Torah, and on the top left, books from the Gershon Sholem collection on Hasidism. The breadth and depth of the collection is immense. As a counterpoint to the Judaica collection, we have the Islam and Middle East collection, which offers a wonderful perspective on the Jewish journey, if you like, as well as insight into contemporary Arab and Palestinian life in the Holy Land. The third collection is our humanities collection, which is a cornerstone of the library, and it specializes in all the humanities that you would expect: classics, philosophy, history of Christianity, and the history of the book. What we see in the background of this slide is some of the handwritten etchings of Sir Isaac Newton, whose papers on philosophy and on religion the library holds, and quite a special collection that is too. The final aspect of the collections is, of course, the Israel collection, where everything to do with the Israeli national history is collected. And we see here in the background the handwritten draft of the words of Hatikva by Naftali Herz Imber from the turn of the previous century. One particular collection that I love is the map collection, and I love showing this slide. You can see on the bottom right, you could see a visualization of Jonah, the book of Jonah. The collection of maps is absolutely extraordinary. It's just one of the many, many highlights in the library's collections, and we're going to see some of those, of course, now in a couple of minutes when Raquel speaks. The library, as I said, is undergoing an immense renewal. This has been in train already for many years, 10, 15 years. At the core of it lies the National of Israel Library, the National Library Law from 2007, which very clearly states what the library's mission is: to collect, preserve, develop, and endow collections of knowledge, heritage, and culture in general, and those of our land and our people in particular. And I want to stop on the word endow. What does it mean to endow? This is one of the great revolutions of the library's renewal. The library used to be a center of research and basically dedicated to the researchers, and it was a cloistered place within the university. Now, as a 21st century library, the library is open-facing. It is reaching out into the community, proactively engaging with the community in order to share the knowledge that it holds, and to ensure that through sharing that knowledge that it plays a positive and constructive role in our society. As our chairman has put it very, very succinctly, it's not a museum. It is a living bridge which connects the wisdom of the past with our world, with today and with tomorrow. And we see this across a huge array of activities that the library initiates: cultural activities, various fora, and discussions and seminars, and I can't any number of any type of interaction that the library can generate. It generates, of course, these pictures from before COVID, but we've been doing all of this stuff online as well over the last year. An interesting thing about the renewal is that kids are now welcome in the library, whereas until 10 years ago, they were forbidden from entering. The library is also very active in the community around the world through programs such as Gesher Europa and other activities. I'm going to take one more minute of your time before handing over to Raquel. I want to talk just for a second about the new library building, which will open in the heart of Jerusalem in 2022. As I said, until now, the library was inside the university. It was a little bit difficult to get to and wasn't really on anybody's map. This new building is going to be on everybody's map. It is amazing. It already looks amazing. The design is compelling. As you already see there's an openness to the design. There won't be a security fence around this building. You will be able to access it from the gardens, from the street. It is a welcoming place, an inclusive place. And the values that I've just mentioned are sort of encapsulated here in the quote from Lord Rothschild. This is going to be a place that brings out the absolute very best of all of us. And it's going to be a destination that every single person on this call and everybody you know, everybody in Israel, we're all going to want to visit there and all going to want to get a sense of it. When you walk into the library, you're going to hit this beautiful circle, the light streaming in from above, and this wonderful spread of books going down floor by floor, basically evoking a sense of the well of knowledge, that there is a well of knowledge, a wellspring of knowledge that we're all able to drink from through coming to the library. The design is by the famous Swiss company Herzog de Meuron, award-winning company, and many of these renderings are, of course, now coming to life. The building is well on its way, and it is due to open in the summer of 2022. And of course, there'll be educational spaces and cultural spaces and so on. This is the view of the building as the architect rendered it, of an evening view. And if maybe you can't see on your right-hand side, if you've got your your camera boxes there of different participants, but behind it on the right there is the Knesset. The building is situated right between the Israel Museum and the Knesset. That's the view from the artist's rendering. Here's the view from this morning. This is the National Library of Israel rising above the ground. You can see the Knesset in the background. This picture was taken from the roof of the old library with a telephoto lens just this morning. The building is happening. It's real. It's not just an imagined thing. And it is going to help the library play, as we said, a significant role in our society and in Jewish life, both through our online work and through the building itself. It's going to make the library a very special place for many, many years to come. And as I said at the beginning, it's our library, our stories, our library. It's your library too. And through the chat now, I'm going to share a few links on how you can connect to the library, each and every person, and enjoy the online offerings even before you come and visit. That's it for my presentation. Now I'm going to introduce you to Raquel. I'm just going to stop with the share screen here so we can get out of me. And here we go. Raquel Euclid is the head of collections at the National Library of Israel. She's responsible for the overall development of all the library's collections and for the digital, cultural, and educational initiatives based on those collections, as well as in partnership with other institutions. Raquel is a New York native, and she received a BA from Princeton and her MA and PhD from Harvard, all in comparative Jewish and Islamic studies. Raquel has published and taught on a wide array of subjects related to comparative Jewish and Islamic traditions, and more recently on the historic currents that shape Israeli society. She's a wonderful presenter and a great ambassador for the library, and it's my pleasure to hand over to Raquel Euclid, who will talk to us about Chana Senesh. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon to those of you in Canada. Greetings from Jerusalem. Thank you so much, DJ, for your kind words, and to the Federation and to the Foreign Ministry and to all of the wonderful organizations that are coming together to help get out the word about this treasure that's sitting here in Jerusalem that reaches across now virtually and hopefully soon physically to serve as the collective memory for the Jewish people worldwide. I want to share with you a story, and I want to do it by opening our vaults virtually, because that's what we're doing today. And I want to delve into the personal writings of an icon, a beloved and heroic figure, Chana Senesh. In November 2020, just about 5 months ago, the archive of Chana Senesh came to the National Library, thanks to the generosity of Ori and Mirit Eisen, who are great friends of the National Library, who live today down south from you in Scottsdale, Arizona. Now, like many of you, I grew up singing Chana Senesh's songs around the campfire and telling the story of her extraordinary bravery. Chana Senesh was killed at just the age of 23. She wrote from early childhood, yet few knew her as a writer in her own lifetime. She left behind an archive of poems and journal entries, photos and artifacts. Her archive allows us to get to know Chana Senesh, to see a full picture of who she was, a multi-dimensional writer who was intrepid and quite brilliant. And she also was vulnerable. She was quite shy, full of her own thoughts and even doubts. I want to model for you how you can use our archives by getting to know this multi-dimensional and complex thinker. And I want to do that by tracing the history of the song Eli Eli, the poem that she called Walking to Caesarea, which is Chana Senesh's most famous, most beloved poem. And I want to show you how the poem developed from its first drafts to the version we know today. But before we get started, I want to take a look at some of the earliest material in the archive so we can understand her origins, her starting points. This is Hannah with her brother Giora, who was a dear friend throughout her short life. Now, Hannah Senesh was born in Budapest in 1921. As we said, we're marking the centenary of her birth this year, to an intellectual Jewish family. Her father, Bella, was a journalist, playwright, and children's literature author who died when Hannah was just 6. The family lived and breathed journalism. Here we see in 1929, her family published a family newspaper they called the Little Seneshes. Here it's typewritten, and young Hannah, who was at this point 8 years old, was the editor. Hannah also wrote devoutly in her diary, and it served as a regular companion. Now, she grew up in 1930s Budapest, and her experiences with the injustices of anti-Semitism there motivated her to become more and more involved in the local Zionist youth movement. Here's a quote from her diary as she transitions from being a Hungarian writer to a Hebrew writer. She writes, "I want to read the Tanakh, the Bible, in Hebrew. I know it will be very difficult, but this is the true language and the most beautiful one, and it is this in the spirit of our people. I can write now without a dictionary and by myself, and certainly with a lot of mistakes, but it constitutes happiness for me because I see that I can learn Hebrew quickly." A little while later, we see that her resolve to just write in Hebrew was not so easy to put into practice, but she tries again, determined. "From today, I will only write only Hebrew in my diary. I was supposed to start already, and I think from now on it will go." Here we see in a later diary entry. In September 1939, after she graduates from what we would call high school, she traveled to Mandatory Palestine. And again, her diary gives us a window. I actually want to read from another page in her diary. This is a translation of her diary and letters by Marta Cohn. May 26, 1940. I must now record that I'm reading some wonderful books, the poems of Rachel, and a book in German by Martin Buber entitled Talks on Judaism. In Rachel, I feel many things. In Buber, I understand many things about Judaism and about myself that I didn't know before. In the sense Buber interprets Judaism, I am a true Jewess. Reading this makes me happy. Here we see a list that she kept on a running basis of the books that she read. And so you can see, I'm going to mark it with my mouse. Number 4, it says Rachel. That is the poet Rachel. And we can see here the movement from other languages, German for Buber and Hebrew for Rachel. Along with the transition to writing in Hebrew, her acculturation process expands to reading in Hebrew. It's striking that she chose Rachel, the pioneer female poet and the symbol of the Chalutzim, the pioneers, who had died a little less than 10 years before, in 1931. There are great parallels between these two young women who wrote poetry and both became Zionist giant myths. In Mandatory Palestine, Senesh attended the Nahalal Agricultural Girls' School, and then she joined the group that built Kibbutz Sdot Yam near Caesarea. Moving now to her time in the land of Israel, where we know her as the poet that her own comrades barely knew. An early version of the poem that we know as Eli Eli was published under Hannah Senesh's name in Haaretz in August 1945, a year after she was captured by the Hungarian fascists, and 9 months after she was executed in November 1944. Haaretz newspaper published the report that there was a paratrooper from the land of Israel named Senesh who was killed in Hungary. The Yishuv leadership understood that Senesh was a compelling figure who could help the recruiting effort, and especially with a poem that was so gentle and humane, especially in the midst of a devastating and horrifying war. Now, those of you who know this poem will notice that the wording is a little different here. My Lord, may you not end for all eternity the sand and the sea. And here, instead of the rush of the waters, the humming of the waters, the buzzing of the waters, the lightning from heaven, and not the prayer of man, but the belief in man, of man, the trust of man. So this is the version that is earlier than the one that became popular. Now, this was actually not the first poem of Senesh's to be published in a newspaper. In fact, a year earlier, in November 1944, her poem called Ashrei HaGaful, Blessed is the Match, was published anonymously with the caption, and here I've blown it up. Under here it says the caption, a chavera, a comrade who went on a special mission, wrote these words right before she left. This poem, Blessed is the Match, was written by Senesh in May 1944. She gave it to a fellow paratrooper, Ruben Daphne, right before she crossed the border between Yugoslavia and Hungary and was caught. He returned home and he showed it to the kibbutz movement, the kibbutz HaMochad leader, Yitzhak Tabenkin, and they decided to publish it in Davar for Women. This is what we would call the Ladies' Journal of Davar. Now, I circled here in red the date. This is November 13th, 1944, meaning 6 days after she was executed. There's no way that the information of her execution had gotten back to people in the land of Israel at that time. This is just a coincidence that points to the power of her life story. Let's return to Haaretz's publication of this poem, Eli Eli, which she called Walking to Caesarea. How did Haaretz's editors get a hold of this poem? And especially this preliminary, this first draft of a poem, which is different than the one we know. Here we return to her diary. The first draft of the poem actually appears in Chana Senesh's diary, which she left in a suitcase under her bed in the kibbutz Sdot Yam in January 1944, along with her letters, her diary, photographs that she took in the land of Israel, and other notes. The suitcase came along with the archive to the library, our library, in November of last year. A Jewish brigade soldier, Moshe Braslavi, went to Sdot Yam after Senesh was killed and found her suitcase. And he discovered in it Chana Senesh's poetry, including this preliminary draft of Eli Eli, Walking to Caesarea. He was from the kibbutz movement, and he and the leader Tabenkin had the poem published in Haaretz. Here is the first draft of the poem. It is dated, right here, it is dated November 24th, 1942. Chana wrote this poem 2 days after Haaretz published the first reports on the destruction of European Jews. On the opposite page over here, we see an entry that's 2 months later. We can only imagine the thoughts that she had during this time of silence. And she refers to it in her diary when she says that just because I haven't written doesn't mean I don't have thoughts. Throughout her time as a pioneer, she wrote in her diary how hard it was to leave her family and especially her mother. And she juxtaposed the dangers of Hungary at the time with the relative tranquility of her life in Israel, Mandatory Palestine. For 2 months, she did not write in her diary. It takes her 2 months of processing this news and for her to come to a radical conclusion. She writes, I've had a shattering week. I was suddenly struck by the idea of going to Hungary. I feel that I must be there during these days in order to help organize youth aliyah, youth immigration to Israel, and also get my mother out. While there were precedents of Zionist pioneers joining the British Army, there were very few precedents for returning to returning to Europe. From then on in her diary, she focuses on how to get back to Europe. And now we go on to the next phase of the story. After she was killed and after her suitcase was found, the kibbutz leadership started doing research on Hannah Senesh. Suddenly, she became this very important figure for them. And they tracked down Hannah Senesh's book of poetry in kibbutz Chatzor. If you remember when Hannah Senesh first arrived in the land of Israel, she attended the Nahalal Agricultural Girls' School. There, she made a dear friend named Miriam Yitzchak. Miriam then joined kibbutz Chatzor. Miriam was the only one who knew that Hannah Senesh was a poet while they were in Nahalal together. Before Hannah Senesh left for paratrooper training in Egypt, she gave the book of poetry to Miriam and inscribed it, "To Miriam Yitzchak, my first and dearest reader and critic, in true friendship, Hannah." On the other side, it says the title of this composition, this book of poetry, which she called Without Language. And in it, and she signed it Hagar, which was her code name for the upcoming mission. In this book, Hannah Senesh copied all of the Hebrew poems she'd saw fit to preserve. And she also copied the original date of composition, which shows a remarkable level of self-awareness for such a young poet. On the first page, we see another dedication, and we see this poem called B'medurot Milchama, in the bonfires of war. And this was actually from 1940, her first Hebrew poem. Now, towards the end of this notebook, we see the final version of the poem. And here we're listening to the singing rendition of Netanella, the beloved Israeli singer. If we look carefully at this poem, first of all, we see that she's still learning Hebrew, right? We have a spelling error here, le'olam, which Haaretz corrected when they published the poem. But now we see the version that we know, the rishrush shel hamayim, the rush of the waters, and not the zimzum, not the buzzing. And instead of imun hadam, the trust of the man, the prayer of the man. This is a time of war. This is a time not of trust, but of prayers. Now notice the date here is 1942, but that's the date of the original composition. As a self-aware poet, she's holding on to her own history. This final version becomes tremendously popular after the war, and becomes published as the anthem of Zionist youth movements all over the world, to the point where it becomes the song that I sang around that campfire as a child. Now, after the war, Katerina Senesh, Hannah's mother, who actually was with her in prison before she was killed, she survives the war and immigrates to Israel, and she brings more of Hannah's writings. She found Miriam Yitzchak, Hannah's friend from Nahalal, and Miriam gave her the notebook. Now here's an interesting library aside. When we received the archive in November, the family told us that the notebook was missing a few pages. How do we know that? Because Hannah numbered the pages. If you saw the final version of Eli Eli, of this poem, Walking to Caesarea, that was page 17. And so the family knew there were missing pages, but they did not know why. My colleague Chesi Amior, who's the Israel curator, the Israel collection curator, was able to solve the mystery for them. In 1951, Katerina received a request from a famous collector at the National Library called Avraham Shvadron, who built what he called an autograph collection of great Jewish heroes. He asked Katerina to share some writings, some autograph writings of Hannah. And she obliged him by tearing out a few pages from this notebook. And so after 70 years, the notebook was reunited and all the pages were put back in. I want to conclude by sharing one of the documents that Katerina brought with her to Israel. This was the note found in Hannah Senesh's pocket in the dress she wore on the day she stood before the firing squad. Dear mother, I don't know what to say, only this. A million thanks, and forgive me if you can. You know so well why words aren't necessary. With love forever, your daughter. This was the note found in her dress pocket. And in the other pocket, there was another note. And that was Hannah Senesh's last poem. Hannah Senesh did not stop writing, not until the last day of her life. As hopefully we've seen, Hannah Senesh's archive brings to life and adds so many layers and dimensions to her songs and poems and to the great icon that she became. Hannah Senesh was a thoughtful and sensitive reader of literature and philosophy. And she was also a person who acted upon her ideals and her principles. This archive is a treasure for all of us, that is now accessible at the National Library of Israel and open to all for research, for study, for exploration. I hope you will all visit virtually for now and very soon in person. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Raquel. This is truly fascinating and truly moving to see those documents coming back to life. So for our audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom. And I will start with 2 questions for you, Raquel, about the library. What is the oldest Hebrew text that you have in the library?
So the oldest Hebrew text is actually a bowl. We have a collection of magical incantation bowls from ancient Babylonia that were from the 5th and 6th century CE. Now, there was almost no textual evidence, Jewish writing textual evidence, until the Cairo Geniza. And so these magical bowls, even though they're not paper, they're not books or codices, they give us an amazing window into Jewish life. It turns out that Jews were specialists. They were kind of pharmacists of the time, because these magical bowls provided solutions both for medical problems and psychological and spiritual problems. And you would go to one of these experts, often they were women, Jewish women, and you would get one of these bowls and you would bury them under your home. And that would hopefully solve your problems.
Wow, thank you. So another question we have, do we have the last poem from her dress pocket? The second one?
We do. That's in the archive as well. They were written in Hungarian, and okay. they are digitized.
And another question, a generic one, which texts are accepted into the National Library, and how do you choose which text gets in?
So we aspire to collect the complete history and writings of Jews and Judaism throughout the world as part of our Judaica collection. Now, how do you define what are writings of Jews? We have very interesting discussions and debates about whether that means writings by Jews, no matter what subject, or does that mean writings by Jews related to Jewish topics or Jewish culture? And that's just one of the lively discussions that we have on a daily basis. And that's our Judaica collection. We also aim to collect as comprehensively as possible the writings, the society, the cultural output of Israel. And as you can imagine, these are aspirations that we work very hard. We have a wonderful team who collects. We collect in about 26 languages, and we collect tens of thousands of items every year. And it's ongoing. What's exciting about the National Library is that it's for us and for future generations. And so it's this open, dynamic collection, and the work is ongoing and endless in a good way.
Thank you, Raquel. So there is another question in the chat. What would her life look like if she wouldn't have been caught? And like, if you could imagine, you know, from her writings to see what would she imagine her life being like?
Well, I think any one of us could answer that question. And so this is not my answering as the head of collections. This is my answering as a person. You know, I was actually talking to a colleague today about Hannah Senesh as an icon whose life was cut off so early in her life. And so she got trapped in her youth. And what would have happened if Hannah Senesh would have made it back to this land, fought in the Independence War, you know, and then went and built her life? Would she have go back to kibbutz? She's ambivalent about kibbutz life. She very much appreciates it, but she struggles with the constant communal activity. Or would she have become a politician? Would she have continued to be a writer? It's a good question. You know, there are other icons that we've seen. I personally thought about Natan Sharansky, whose archive is also at the National Library. And I grew up marching for Natan Sharansky, Anatoly Sharansky then. And I remember when he came to the United States after he was released, I was a child. I think I was 8 or 10 years old, and I handed him a rose. And the difference is Natan Sharansky, thank God, he moved to Israel. He became a politician. He became the head of the Jewish agency. He became a public figure. And so the iconic status of him, you know, was at some level effaced because he was a real person. But how wonderful that we've been able to see Natan Sharansky as a real person and not just a myth.
Yeah, that's very true. We have one more question from Shula Reinhardt from Brandeis University regarding the difference between the Hannah Senesh archives and the library collections in general.
Thank you for that question, because it'll clarify something that might not have been clear. As DJ said, when we talk about our collections, we talk about, many, many different formats. And so that means books, that means archival material, tens of millions of archival pages. Now we have digital archives as well, music, maps, etc. And so Hannah Senesh's archive has come into our collection, so it's part of our collections. We rarely have material on deposit that is on deposit at the library, but not part of our collections. But in this case, because of the wonderful gift of the Eisen family, the Hannah Senesh archive has become part of our collections.
Raquel, could you just clarify the difference also between the library's holdings and the role of the Central Zionist Archives and the state archives?
Sure. So in addition to the National Library of Israel's collections, the library has a subsidiary called the Central Archives of the History of the Jewish People. And that is a treasure, that's a hidden treasure of community archives that was established in order to collect documentary evidence first and foremost from communities that were decimated in the Shoah, and with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe, and then slowly expanded over time to collect archival material from North Africa, from Western Europe, some from the United States, some from other places, and it's again an ongoing project. In that case, the Central Archives goes into communities and will copy material. Sometimes it has original material, but often it's about making a copy. One of the types of work that we do when we say we're the Library of the Jewish People, I would use the analogy today of, if you can imagine, we're the backup copy, we're the remote digital storage for the Jewish people. Now, in the olden days when they didn't have digital storage, so they went and they did photocopies, or they did mimeographed, or whatever they did in the Stone Age. But for now, we see our role as not taking, but complementing, supporting, and ensuring that the great diversity of Jewish life all over the world will be available for now and for future generations.
Thank you, Raquel. There were people in the audience who asked how they can connect with you. So
I'm happy to give my...
You can give your information in the chat, and we are happy to send the recording along with your information after we conclude this webinar. So no problem about that. There is one more question. There is just a note from R.D. Ham, who noted in the Q&A that although he's not Jewish, he is a good friend of Hannah's nephew David, yeah. and he knew her brother George, and he used Hannah's poem "Blast" in the match as a dedication on his master's thesis. So this is really moving, and I'm sure it is exciting. So there is someone who would like to add 2 remarks about Hannah and Nathan, and I'll just see if I can let them let them talk. I'll just find them in the participant, just a second. And while I'll do that, I'll just check for, I think we might have some more questions. Oh, I can see that you put your information. Wonderful. Was Hannah buried in Israel? That's another question from the chat. Was her body returned to Israel?
The truth is, I don't know. I didn't read anywhere that her body was brought to Israel, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. But I can find that out.
Thank you. Okay, unfortunately, I cannot find the person who asked to join in. So I think we will conclude now by thanking you and thanking DJ and the consulate and Ezra and Candice for being here, and for all the audience for joining us today. And we will share the recording of this webinar. And thank you so much, Raquel, for sharing this amazing archive and all these materials.
Wait, yes. I'm sorry. In the middle, thanks to Wikipedia, her body was brought to Israel in 1950 and was buried in Mount Herzl.
Thank you for your prompt response to that as well. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and we will of course keep you posted for our upcoming webinars. And have a wonderful rest of your day, and a good night to our Israeli audience. Good night, Raquel. Thank you so much.